Princess Kalyra stood in the center of the Celestial Council chamber, with her head held high despite the chains that bound her wrists. The chains were made of pure starlight energy, and they burned against her silver skin, but she refused to show. Pain around her sat the 12 eldest members of the Silveran race, each one ancient beyond human comprehension, their faces carved from centuries of wisdom and cold judgment. Behind Kalyra, pressed against the energy barrier that contained them both, was Vex. Her dragon companion was massive, his crystalline scales shifting through colors that had no names in any human language. His eyes glowed with barely contained fury, and small wisps of plasma escaped from between his fangs. The bond between them sang with rage and fear and defiance. The lead counselor, Elder Morwen, raised one pale hand and the chamber fell silent. The charges were read aloud for all to hear, and for all the watching civilizations to witness through the broadcast that stretched across 100 star systems. Kalyra had led an unauthorized strike against 3 human colony vessels near the Meridian Belt. Her reasoning had been tactical. The humans were expanding too close to a sacred Silvaran breeding ground where young dragons learned to fly between stars, but reasoning did not matter. When 2,000 human lives were lost in the attack that followed, Vex had been magnificent and terrible in his fury, tearing through the colony ships with precision that came from 1,000 years of bonded combat. They had not meant to kill so many. They had meant only to frighten, to warn, to push back. But humans were fragile, and their ships were not built to withstand dragon fire. Elder Morwen spoke, and her voice carried the weight of ages. The Silveran Empire could not afford war with humanity, not now when the borders of known space were threatened by something far worse than human ambition. The Void Swarm was coming, and every civilization would need allies to survive. Kalyra had endangered the fragile peace that took decades to build. She had acted on impulse and pride, and now she would face consequences that matched the magnitude of her crime. The sentence came like a blade through Kalyra's heart. She would marry a human, not just any human, but the captain whose family had died in the attack she ordered. His name was Luke Harrison, and he had lost his wife and young daughter when their transport ship was caught in the crossfire. The marriage would be legal and binding under both human and Silveran law. She would live among humans and serve as a symbol of peace and reparation. She would be a living reminder that even the proud Silvaran must bow to justice. When they caused harm, Kalyra felt Vex roar inside her mind, and the dragon threw himself against the barrier with such force that cracks appeared in the energy field. Guards rushed forward with containment weapons, but Elder Morwen raised her hand again. "The dragon will go with her," the elder said, "for to separate a Silveran from their bonded companion would be a cruelty too far. But make no mistake, Princess Kalyra, this is not a negotiation. You will marry the human, or you will be stripped of your title, your bond, and your life force. You will become nothing, a shade wandering the void until even memory of you fades. You have 1 lunar cycle to prepare." The chamber dissolved around her, and Kalyra found herself back in her holding cell, with Vex coiled around her in protective fury. She buried her face in his crystalline scales and allowed herself 1 moment of weakness. Then she stood and began to prepare for the worst fate she could imagine, being bound forever to a creature who lived barely a century, who could not hear the song of stars, who knew nothing of the ancient ways. 28 days later, Kalyra stood in the docking bay of the diplomatic vessel. Harmony's hoped she wore her ceremonial battle armor because she refused to dress like a bride for this mockery of a wedding. The armor was silver and blue, etched with the history of her bloodline going back 10,000 years. Vex stood beside her. His scales deliberately shifted to deep crimson, the color of challenge and barely restrained violence. The human delegation arrived in a shuttle that looked crude and clumsy compared to Silveran ships. But Kalyra had studied human tactics during the war councils, and she knew better than to underestimate them. Humans were short-lived, but they burned bright and fierce. They innovated in decades what took her people centuries. They bred like stars going nova, and they spread across space with relentless determination. The shuttle door opened, and Luke Harrison stepped out. Kalyra had seen his image in the trial documents, but seeing him in person was different. He was tall for a human, though still shorter than her by a head. His hair was dark and cut short in military fashion. His face was scarred, 3 lines running from his left temple to his jaw, and his eyes were the color of Earth's oceans during storm season. He wore a formal, military uniform with medals she did not recognize, and his posture spoke of rigid control. Behind him came his second-in-command, a woman named Sophie Grant, who watched Kalira with undisguised hostility. There were other humans too, guards and diplomats and witnesses. Luke Harrison walked toward her with measured steps and stopped exactly 3 paces away. The distance protocol, demanded for first meetings between bonded Silveran and unbonded outsiders. He did not bow and he did not smile. "I am Captain Luke Harrison of the Terran Defense Forces," he said, and his voice was rough like stone grinding against stone. "I understand you are to be my wife." Kalira met his gaze without flinching. "I am Princess Kalira of the House of Starlight, bonded to Vex the Eternal, daughter of the Emperor, and heir to 3 systems. I am condemned to marry you as punishment for my actions. I will fulfill the sentence, but know this, human. I will never bow to you, I will never submit to your kind, and I will count every day of this marriage as a cage I cannot escape." Something flickered in Luke Harrison's storm-colored eyes. It might have been pain or anger, or something deeper that Kalira did not want to name good. He said simply, "Because I want this marriage even less than you do. Your attack killed my wife and my daughter. My wife's name was Margaret, and she loved growing flowers in impossible places, making gardens bloom on colony ships where nothing should. My daughter's name was Emma, and she was 6 years old, and she loved dragons. She had pictures of them on her walls, and she made me read her stories about them every night. She thought dragons were beautiful and noble, and good." Kalira felt something. Cold spread through her chest. Vex made a low sound. Not quite a growl, but something softer and more terrible. Luke Harrison continued, his voice never rising but growing harder with each word. "So you will forgive me if I do not celebrate this union. The council says we must marry to prevent war, and I will do my duty because that is what I do. But do not expect me to pretend this is anything other than what it is. 2 people trapped in a cage neither of them wanted, forced together by politics and the need to pretend that justice has been served." He turned away and gestured to his delegation. "The ceremony will be in 3 days. I suggest you prepare yourself, Princess." Then he walked back to his shuttle without another word. Kalira stood frozen in the docking bay long after the humans left. Vex pressed against her side, and she felt his confusion mixing with her own. She had expected hatred. She had expected rage. She had expected a human who would lord this power over her or who would try to break her spirit. Instead, she found a man who was as trapped as she was, a man who had loved and lost, and who now faced a future bound to his enemy. Sophie Grant stayed behind after the others left. She approached carefully, hand on her weapon, and stopped at a respectful distance. "My captain is a good man," Sophie said quietly. "The best man I have ever served with. He does not deserve this any more than you do, but he will do his duty, and he will treat you with honor even. If it kills him inside, I suggest you do the same." Then she too was gone, and Kalira was alone with Vex in the empty docking bay. The dragon spoke in her mind for the first time since the sentencing. "The human carries great pain," Vex said. "His soul is damaged but not broken. This will be harder than we thought, my princess, because it would be easier to hate a monster than to be bound to someone who suffers as we do." Kalira had no answer. She returned to her chambers and stood at the window looking out at the stars. In 3 days she would marry Luke Harrison. In 3 days her punishment would truly begin. But somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that perhaps punishment and the human's pain were not the only things waiting for her in this unwanted marriage. She silenced that voice immediately. She was Silveran. She was a princess. She would endure this sentence with dignity and pride, and she would never, ever let herself care about the human whose life she had destroyed. Beneath the bruised sky of Terra Nova, the wind carried more than dust, it carried whispers, and Lyra felt them coil around her like smoke. She had not slept in 2 nights, not since the patrol vanished, not since she saw the marks on the ground near the eastern ridge, marks that did not belong to human boots or elven sandals. They were too wide, too deep, and too wrong. The edges shimmered faintly as if reality itself had hesitated before closing over them. Daniel had tried to keep her away from The ridge, he said, it was unstable, dangerous, that the ground could collapse without warning. But Lyra only looked at him with those storm-gray eyes and said, "I am not afraid of falling. I am afraid of what waits below." And that was enough to make him nod and load extra power cells into his rifle. They traveled at dawn when the twin suns cast long shadows that hid more than they revealed. Kale flew ahead, his bronze scales catching the light like old coins, his wings slicing the air with quiet precision. Every few minutes he would dip low, circle back, and let out a soft chuff sound. Only Lyra understood it meant clear for now. But something is watching. The eastern ridge was not a natural formation. It rose too sharply, too evenly, like a blade driven into the planet's flesh, and at its base lay the ruins of mining outpost 7 abandoned, after a cave-in 20 years ago, or so the records claimed. But Lyra knew better. The stone here was older than human history, older than Elven, records older than the Alliance itself. As they stepped into the shadow of the ridge, the air changed. It grew thick and cold. Not the dry cold of high altitude, but the damp chill of deep places where time pooled like water. Daniel adjusted his visor, his breath fogging the glass slightly. He did not speak, but his hand hovered near his sidearm, a habit born of too many ambushes. Lyra knelt and ran her fingers along a crack in the rock. Her skin tingled. Not with pain, but with recognition. The glyphs were faint, almost worn away, but she knew them from the forbidden scrolls her mother had hidden beneath the floorboards of their sky palace, symbols of binding, of awakening, of warning. Kale landed beside her, with a soft thud, his tail curling around, her legs protectively. His eyes narrowed to slits, scanning the darkness ahead. Then he hissed a low, urgent sound that made the hairs on Daniel's neck rise. "What is it?" Lyra whispered. Kyle did not answer in words, but in feeling a ripple of fear and anger and something else. Something ancient. Daniel stepped forward, his boots crunching on loose shale. He activated his wrist light, and the beam cut through the gloom, revealing a tunnel entrance partially collapsed but still passable. The walls inside were smooth, too smooth for natural rock, and covered in more glyphs pulsing faintly with a light that had no source. Lyra stood slowly, her heart hammering. Not from fear, but from understanding. This was not a mine. This was a tomb, a prison, a cradle. They moved deeper, the tunnel sloping downward, the air growing heavier with each step. Daniel kept his rifle ready, but his eyes kept flicking to Lyra, watching how she moved, how she touched the walls, how her breath caught when she saw certain symbols. After what felt like hours, they reached a chamber, circular and vast, its ceiling lost in shadow. The floor marked with concentric rings of stone, each carved with spiraling patterns that seemed to shift when not looked at. Directly in the center stood a pedestal, and on it rested a sphere of black crystal, no larger than a human head, but humming with a vibration that made their teeth ache. Lyra approached slowly, her hand outstretched but not touching. "Do not move," she said, her voice barely audible. Daniel froze mid-step. "What is it?" "This is not a weapon," he said. "It feels like a key." "It is both," she replied. Kale circled the chamber once, then twice, his wings brushing the walls each time he passed. The glyphs flared brighter, as if responding to his presence. Then the ground trembled, not violently but with purpose, like something waking from a long sleep. The black sphere pulsed once, a wave of energy rolling outward, not hot, not cold, but alive. It passed through them, and for a moment, Lyra saw flashes, images of cities made of light ships sailing between stars, beings with eyes like galaxies, and then silence. Daniel staggered back, gripping his head. "What was that, a memory?" She said, a warning, before he could ask more. The entrance collapsed behind them, sealing them, and dust rained from the ceiling, and the glyphs on the walls began to glow steadily now. Not flickering, but burning with soft white light. And then they heard it. A sound like wind through dead trees, like metal scraping on bone, like voices speaking in a language that had no words, only intent. Daniel raised his rifle, but there was nothing to aim at. Lyra closed her eyes and listened. "They are not here to kill," she said. "They are testing us." "Test us for what?" "To see if we are worthy to remember." Kale landed beside her and pressed his head against her side, a gesture of comfort and readiness. Then the shadows moved, not as absence of light, but as substance, as form. Figures emerged from the walls, not solid, not ghostly, but somewhere between their outlines, shifting their faces blank. Yet somehow watching, Daniel fired a warning shot. The plasma bolt passed through the nearest figure and struck the far wall, exploding in a shower of sparks. But the figure did not react. It only tilted its head as if curious to not fight them. Lyra said, "They are not enemies, they are echoes." She stepped forward, arms at her sides, palms open. "I am Lyra of Virellis. Daughter of the skyline, I come not to take, but to understand." The figure stilled. Then one drifted closer, stopping. Just an arm's length away, it raised a hand not to strike but to touch, and as its fingers neared Lyra's chest, the black sphere on the pedestal flared bright enough to cast sharp shadows. Spain lanced through her skull. Not her own pain, but the pain of a dying world. A civilization that reached too far too fast and paid the price in silence. She gasped and fell to her knees. Daniel moved to help her, but Kale blocked his path with a low growl. Not aggressive, but firm let her. See, he seemed to say, and Lyra did see. She saw the old ones not as monsters, but as gardeners. They planted life across the stars not to rule, but to watch, to see if any species could rise above hunger and fear and choose unity. The elves had been their first hope, but fear had twisted them into isolationists hoarding knowledge like treasure. The humans were their second chance, chaotic. Yes, but capable of compassion. Sacrifice, connection. And now the old ones were waking again, not to judge, but to offer one last choice. The vision faded and Lyra opened her eyes, tears tracing clean lines through the dust on her cheeks. "They are not evil," she whispered. "They are waiting for what?" For someone to say yes, before Daniel could respond. The chamber shook again, harder. This time cracked spiderwebbing across the floor. The glyphs dimming as if exhausted. "We have to go," she said. "But the entrance is gone." Kyle stepped to the far wall and breathed not fire but a stream of blue light that struck the stone and made it ripple. "Like water in exit," she said, "it will not hold long." They ran behind them. The chamber collapsed inward, the black sphere sinking into the earth as if swallowed, the figures dissolving back into the walls, the light fading until only darkness remained. They emerged into the open air, gasping. "The sun's high now. The day half gone." Daniel leaned against a boulder, catching his breath, his face pale. "What do we do now?" "We tell the truth," she said. "No more secrets. No more fear. But who will believe us?" "Those who need." Tokiel landed beside them, his sides heaving but his eyes bright with purpose. As they made their way back to the colony, Lyra felt different, lighter yet heavier. The weight of knowledge pressing on her shoulders, but also a strange peace she had spent. Her life bound by rules, by bloodlines, by silence. And now she had seen something beyond all of that. Daniel walked beside her, not speaking but his presence steady like an anchor. When they reached the outskirts of the settlement, they found chaos people, ran through the streets shouting, pointing to the sky. Lyra looked up and saw it, a shape in the clouds, not a ship, not a storm, but something vast and slow, moving trailing tendrils of light that curled like smoke. "The convergence has begun," she said. Daniel turned to her, his face grim but determined. "Then we stop hiding." She nodded, "and we start choosing." That night they gathered the colony leaders in the central hall. Not the military, not the politicians, but the teachers, the medics, the farmers, the ones who kept the colony alive, not through force but through care. Lyra stood before them. Kale coiled at her feet, his eyes scanning the room for threats. She told them everything, about the old ones, about the glyphs, about the choice. Some laughed, others grew angry. A few walked out, but many stayed, their eyes wide. Not with fear, but with wonder. One woman, an engineer named Claire, spoke first. "So they are not attacking us. They are asking us to grow up in a way." "Yes," Lyra said. Another man, a medic named Jude, asked, "What happens if we say nothing? Nothing changes?" She replied, "The old ones will sleep again, and we will keep fighting each other until there is nothing left to fight for." Silence fell over the room, heavy with thought. Then Claire stood. "I say we try others," nodded slowly at first, then with more certainty. Daniel watched from the back of the room, pride and fear warring in his chest. He had spent his life following orders, but now he was part of something bigger than orders, bigger than war. Later, as the meeting broke up, Lyra stepped outside the cool night air, a relief after the tension inside. Kale landed beside her, his wings folding neatly. "You did well?" he seemed to say. She smiled faintly. "We all did." Daniel joined her, leaning against the railing, his uniform stained with dust and sweat. "You know they will come for you," she said. "The Elven Council, they will not allow this knowledge to spread. Let them." "Come," he replied. "I am not giving you back," she. The capital dome of Terra Nova rose like a silver crown against the bruised horizon, its surface shimmering with energy, shields that pulsed in time with the colony's heartbeat. Beneath it lay the heart of human ambition, a fusion reactor humming, with steady power, but Lyra knew better. The real pulse came from deeper below, from the place where the old ones slept and now stirred. She stood at the edge of the dome's perimeter, her cloak pulled tight against the wind. Kale circling above his, bronze scales catching the last light of dusk. Daniel stood beside her, his face lined with exhaustion but his eyes sharp with purpose. They had spent days preparing for this, not with weapons, but with truth, gathering those who believed in the choice. The old ones offered engineers, medics, former soldiers, all of them tired of war, ready for something new. But Lyra felt it, the tension in the air, the wrongness beneath the ground. The glyphs had spoken of a convergence, and it was coming faster than they expected. "We have to go down," she said, her voice low but firm. Daniel nodded. He had stopped arguing with her days ago, not because he always agreed, but because he had learned to trust her instincts. The entrance to the underlevels was hidden beneath a maintenance hatch near the reactor core, a place few humans ever visited. The air inside was thick with the smell of ozone, and old metal stairs spiraled downward into darkness, their footsteps echoing like whispers in a tomb Kyle could not follow. Not yet. The tunnels were too narrow for his growing form, but he landed on the hatch above, letting out a soft chuff that meant, "I am here if you call." The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, not just with dust, but with memory. Every wall, every pipe seemed to hum with the same frequency as the black sphere they had seen in the eastern ridge, and Lyra's skin prickled with recognition. This place was built on top of something older, something sacred. Daniel activated his wrist light, the beam, cutting through the gloom, revealing walls lined with strange markings. Not human, not elven, but something in between. Spirals and lines that seemed to shift when not looked at directly. "You see it too," she said. "See what?" "The pattern. It is the same as in the ridge, but stronger. More focused." He frowned, studying the walls like a map, like a keyhole. They reached a junction, 3 tunnels branching off in different directions, each marked with a symbol that made Lyra's breath catch. The left bore the mark of binding, the right the mark of silence, and the center the mark of awakening. "We take the center," she said without hesitation. The tunnel sloped downward, the air growing colder with each step, the hum louder. Now almost a voice, not speaking words, but feelings. Images flickered at the edge of Lyra's vision. Cities of light ships sailing between stars, beings with eyes like galaxies. And then silence. Daniel gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white. "You okay?" She nodded, but her steps slowed as they approached a massive door carved from black stone, covered in glyphs that pulsed with soft white light. "This is it." The door opened, not with a sound, but with a feeling, as if the stone itself recognized her bloodline. Beyond lay a chamber vast and circular, its ceiling lost in shadow. The floor marked with concentric rings of stone, each carved with spiraling patterns that seemed to move when not watched. In the center stood a monolith of obsidian taller than 3 humans, its surface smooth and dark but humming with a slow rhythmic light embedded within it. Near the base was a cavity where the black crystal core should rest, but it was empty. Someone had been here. Lyra stepped forward, her heart pounding not with fear but with dread. They took it, who before she could answer the chamber sealed behind them with a soft click. Not a sound of metal but of stone, locking into place. Figures emerged from the shadows, not hollowed humans this time, but elves cloaked in silver, their faces hidden beneath hoods but their presence unmistakable. The sigil on their cloaks, the mark of the High Council. At their head stood Vera, her face serene, her eyes cold as winter stars. "You were never meant to survive the journey." "Lyra," she said, her voice smooth, As glass, you were bait, a distraction to draw out the old one's influence so we could claim it for ourselves. Lyra's blood ran cold. You knew we knew the awakening would begin here. We knew the humans would stumble upon it. We sent you to confirm its location and then to die quietly in your human cage. And Daniel Vera's lips curled in a faint smile. He was never part of the plan. Expendable, like all humans. Daniel did not flinch. He only shifted his stance slightly, putting himself between Lyra and the elves, his rifle still lowered but his eyes sharp. You made a mistake, Vera, Lyra said, stepping forward, her voice steady. And what is that? You underestimated him. In that moment, Kale roared from above, the sound shaking the chamber, dust raining. From the ceiling, the elves flinched, their hands flying to their weapons, but Kale was not attacking. Not yet. He was warning. Daniel moved fast. Not toward Vera, but to the side. Slamming his rifle butt into a control node on the wall, sparks flew, and the chamber lights flickered. The ground trembled. Vera's eyes widened. What did you do? Bought us time, he said. Lyra did not wait. She ran to the monolith, pressing her hands against the obsidian surface, closing her eyes and reaching deep into the hum, into the memory, into the truth. The old ones were not weapons, they were witnesses, and they had chosen her not because of her bloodline but because of her choice. The monolith responded. Light erupted from its surface, not blinding but illuminating, washing over the chamber, revealing hidden panels, hidden pathways, hidden truths. Vera raised her hand, a device glowing in her palm, clearly meant to control the monolith. You will not take this from us, she hissed. But Lyra was no longer just a princess. She was a bridge. She screamed, not in pain but in revelation, and the monolith opened. From its core rose the black crystal, not stolen but waiting, held in stasis, until the right hand touched it. Lyra seized it. Energy surged through her veins like wildfire, burning away. Doubt, fear, hesitation. The crystal fused to her chest, glowing softly, its light spreading through her body until her skin shimmered with starlight. Vera staggered back, her device sparking and dying in her hand. What have you done? I accepted the choice. The chamber shook violently, cracks spreading across the floor, the glyphs on the walls flaring bright, then dimming, then flaring again. Daniel grabbed Lyra's arm. We have to go now. But Vera was not done. She raised her other hand and spoke, a word in the old tongue, a word of binding. The monolith shuddered. You think you are the first to be chosen, she spat. There were others before you, they all broke. Lyra looked at her, not with anger but with pity. They broke because they were alone, I am. Notkale crashed through the ceiling, then not with fire but with force, his massive form landing between the elves and the humans. His wings flared, his eyes blazing with ancient light. Vera and her envoys retreated, not in fear, but in calculation. They vanished into the shadows the way they came, leaving behind only the echo of their presence and the hum of the awakening monolith. The ground trembled again. Harder this time. The whole dome is coming down. Daniel said. Not the dome. Lyra replied. The veil, what veil? The one between world. Above them the sky split with auroras of impossible color, green and violet and gold swirling like living paint. The air crackled with energy, and from the monolith's ruins rose a being of light and shadow, neither solid nor spectral, its form shifting like smoke through stars. It spoke not in words but in feelings. Grief, hope, warning. Lyra understood. The old ones had seeded life not to rule but to witness, to see if any species could rise above conquest and choose unity. The elves had failed, consumed by fear. They sought to weaponize the gift. The humans, fractured and desperate, were on the brink of the same mistake. But Lyra stood between them, the crystal core fused to her chest, glowing softly. Kyle circled above his fire, now a beacon, not a blade. Daniel stood beside her rifle, lowered his presence, a silent vow. The being reached out, not with a hand, but with intent, and Lyra stepped forward, meeting it, not as a ruler, not as a warrior, but as a witness. In that moment the convergence began, not as destruction, but as revelation. Light poured from the chamber, spreading across Terra Nova, not burning, not blinding, but showing every human, every elf, every living thing the truth of their connection, the fragility of their divisions, the possibility of something more in the colony. People stopped fighting, stopped hiding, stopped fearing. They looked up at the sky and saw not an invasion, but an invitation. Back in the chamber, the being began to fade its form, dissolving into motes of light that swirled around Lyra before vanishing into the crystal on her chest. The old ones were not gone. They were waiting, and Lyra knew what came next. She turned to Daniel, her eyes clear, her voice steady. They will come for us now, the Council, the Alliance, the fleets. They will see this as a threat. Let them come. He replied, I am not giving you back. O landed beside them, his sides heaving but his eyes bright with purpose. The storm was coming, but for the first time in her life, Lyra did not fear it. She was ready, and this time she would not stand alone. The days after the convergence passed in a blur of motion and meaning. The sky above Terra Nova still shimmered with echoes of the old one's light. Not fading but settling like dust after a storm. People moved differently now, not with the stiff caution of those expecting violence, but with the quiet urgency of those who had seen something true and could not unsee. Lyra stood on the central plaza, her hands resting on the railing of the observation deck, the crystal core embedded in her. Chest pulsed softly with each breath, not painful but present like a second heartbeat. Daniel stood beside her, his uniform patched but clean, his eyes scanning the crowds below. Not for threats, but for hope. They had not slept much since the chamber, beneath the dome collapsed, sealing the monolith, but not before its light had touched every soul on the planet. Some had run screaming into the wilds, unable to bear the weight of truth. Others had fallen to their knees, weeping for reasons they could not name, but many had gathered here in the heart of the colony. Not as soldiers or citizens, but as something new, as witnesses. Cal circled above his wings, casting wide shadows that rippled with starlight. His size had grown again, not just in body, but in presence, his scales now holding constellations within them, shifting with his mood. His fire no longer a weapon, but a language of warmth and warning. Claire. The engineer approached first, her hands stained with grease, her eyes bright with purpose. The reactor is stable, she said, but it is not the source anymore. Lyra nodded. The real power is the core. The old ones did not give us energy. They gave us connection. Jude, the medic, followed, carrying a satchel of herbs and bandages. People are healing faster. He said wounds that should take weeks are closing in days, and not just bodies, minds too. The nightmares are gone. Lyra smiled faintly. That is the gift, not control but clarity. More came: teachers, farmers, pilots, mechanics, all of them changed, not by force but by choice. They spoke of dreams shared across distances, of understanding that bloomed without words, of a sense that they were part of something larger than themselves. But Lyra knew it would not last. The Alliance would not allow this to stand, and she was right. On the fourth morning, Kale landed hard on the plaza. His wings flared, his eyes wide with alarm. He let out a low rumble that sent shivers through the crowd. Daniel looked up, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. What is it? Lyra closed her eyes and listened. Not with her ears, but with the core. They are coming. Who? The fleet, not human, not rebel, but elven warships, cloaked and silent, hanging at the edge of orbit, their hulls sharp as knives, their intent colder than space. The High Sovereign himself commanded the flagship, a vessel shaped like a crescent moon, its surface gleaming with ancient runes meant to ward off truth. Lyra did not panic. She had expected this. Gather, everyone, she said, not in fear but in readiness. The people did not scatter. They gathered in the plaza, not armed but present, standing shoulder to shoulder, humans, and the few dissenting elves who had followed Lyra's signal after the convergence. All of them watching the sky. Daniel stood at Lyra's side, his voice low. What do we do? We show them the truth. You think they will listen? They may not, but they will see above them. The sky darkened, not with clouds, but with ships descending slowly, gracefully, like predators circling prey. The lead vessel hovered directly over the dome, its shadow swallowing the light. A voice echoed across the plaza, not through speakers but through the air itself. Deep, resonant, and cold. Lyra of Varelli's. You have defiled the bloodline. You have consorted with lesser beings. You have awakened what should have remained buried. Return the core, surrender. The human, and your exile will end it, was the sovereign. His face appearing in the sky, not as a projection, but as a presence. His eyes hard, his mouth set in a line of finality. Lyra stepped forward alone, her cloak fluttering in the wind, the crystal on her chest glowing brighter in response to his voice. "I will not surrender him," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Nor will I return the core, because it was never yours to claim." The sovereign's eyes narrowed. "You speak like a traitor." "I speak like a witness." Kale landed beside her, his wings spread wide, his eyes fixed on the flagship, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Daniel did not move. He stood where he was, his hands at his sides, his presence a quiet defiance. The sovereign raised a hand and the fleet shifted weapons, powering up energy cannons humming to life. The plaza tensed, but no one ran. Lyra closed her eyes and reached deep into the core, into the memory, into the choice. And she activated it. Light erupted from her chest, not blinding, not burning, but illuminating it. Shot upward like a pillar striking the flagship, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. For a moment. Nothing happened. Then the sovereign gasped, and every elven soldier on every ship saw not an enemy below, but themselves reflected in the faces of humans who had chosen compassion over conquest, unity over control. They saw their own fear, their own isolation, their own hunger for power, and, for the first time in centuries, they saw an alternative. The sovereign staggered back, his image flickering. "What is this sorcery?" "It is not sorcery. It is truth." The old ones spoke then, not through Lyra, but through the light itself, their voice now clear, not in words but in feeling. "You were never meant to rule the stars, you were meant to share them." Silence fell over the fleet, heavy with thought. The sovereign looked down at Lyra, not with anger, but with something new, something fragile, like the first. "Crack in ice, you have changed," she said. No, Lyra replied, "You have remembered." The fleet did not fire. They did not retreat. They simply hovered, watching, waiting, on the ground. The people of Terra Nova held their breath, then one by one the elven ships powered down their weapons. The sovereign's voice came again, softer now. "This will not go unnoticed. The council will call for your head. Then let them come." Lyra said, "I will meet them, not with fire but with truth." The flagship turned, slowly ascending back into the sky, the fleet following like shadows returning to their source. When they were gone, the plaza erupted not in cheers but in quiet. Daniel walked to Lyra, his steps slow, his eyes searching hers. "You did it. We did it." Kyle nuzzled her hand, his rumble. Now a purr. In the days that followed, Terra Nova became something new. Not a colony, not a fortress, but a sanctuary. A place where humans and elves and even a few curious beings from the outer rim came not to fight, but to learn, to listen, to remember. Lyra and Daniel never held a formal wedding. They did not need to. Their bond was written in every decision they made, every life they saved, every bridge they built. Kale often carried children on his back during festivals, his fire lighting the night with gentle warmth, and Lyra walked among the people, not as royalty but as a guide. Her punishment had become her everything, not because she married a human, but because she chose to believe in something greater than bloodlines or borders, and in that choice, she found not just love but purpose. The storm had passed, and in its wake grew something new. Weeks passed, and the sky above Terra Nova settled into a quiet rhythm, no longer split by auroras or shadowed by warships, but holding a soft silver glow like breath on glass. The people moved with purpose. Not urgency, building, not barricading, planting, not patrolling the fields once barren. Now sprouted crops that shimmered faintly at dusk, fed by soil touched by the old ones. Light Lyra walked among them barefoot, her cloak frayed at the edges, her hair loose and wind tangled the crystal core. On her chest no longer a wound, but a part of her like a second heart, its pulse steady and calm. She no longer flinched at its warmth. It had become as natural as breathing. Daniel followed a few steps behind, not as a guard, but as a companion. His rifle slung over his shoulder, unused for days, his hands calloused now from helping rebuild the eastern hydroponics bay. Instead of cleaning weapons, he carried seedlings now. Not shell scale, soared above his wings, wide enough to shade a dozen children, who laughed and pointed as he dipped low then higher, his scales catching the twin suns and scattering light like falling stars. He was no longer just a dragon. He was a promise made visible. The colony had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Walls between sectors had been torn down not by force but by invitation. Shared kitchens sprang up in every district where humans taught elves how to bake bread, and elves showed humans how to weave light into cloth not for war but for warmth. Claire and a group of engineers had repurposed old defense drones into pollinators, their tiny rotors humming as they drifted from flower to flower, while Jude and his healers set up open clinics where wounds were treated not just with synth gel but with song and silence both. But Lyra knew peace was not the absence of threat, it was the presence of choice, and choices had consequences. One evening as the suns dipped below the ridge, a signal pulsed through the core, not loud, not violent, but clear. Summons, they are coming, she said. Daniel looked up from the irrigation lines he had been mending. The council, not just the council, the whole alliance. He wiped his hands on his pants and stood. How long? 3 days, maybe 4. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. This time they will not send warships. They will send envoys, judges, scholars, the ones who shape belief, not just enforce it, and you will face them alone. No, she said, turning to him for the first time in days with something like sorrow in her eyes. I will not face them at all. He frowned. What do you mean? I mean they do not get to judge us anymore. Before he could ask more, Kyle landed beside them, his wings folding with a soft rustle. His eyes fixed on Lyra with understanding beyond words. That night they gathered everyone in the central plaza, not under threat but under starlight. The air cool, the ground warm from the day's sun. Lyra stood on the old command platform, now overgrown with moon blossoms, their petals glowing faintly blue. She did not speak at first, she simply opened her chest, not literally, but through the core, letting the light flow outward, not as a beam but as a blanket, washing over every face, every hand. Every heart. Visions came not forced but offered. They saw the first gardeners seeding worlds not with commands but with care. They saw elves turning inward, building walls instead of bridges. They saw humans reaching outward, not always wisely but always trying. They saw the moment Lyra chose Daniel not as duty, but as trust, and they saw KL not as pet but as partner. When the light faded, no one spoke for a long time. Then Claire stood. So what now? Now we show them that judgment is not the only way. Lyra said, we do not wait for their verdict. We offer them a seat at the table. Jude nodded slowly. They will not understand. Maybe not at first, but understanding grows when it is watered. Daniel stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm, and if they refuse, then they refuse themselves. The next morning work began, not on defenses but on welcome. The plaza was cleared. Not for battle but for gathering. Tables were built from salvaged ship plating chairs carved from ridgewood lanterns strung between poles. Not for light but for beauty. Kale flew to the eastern ridge and returned with armfuls of crystalline leaves that chimed softly in the wind. He placed them at the entrance like a threshold. On the 3rd day, the sky shimmered, not with weapons, but with ships shaped like open hands. Their hulls smoothed their colors, soft white and gold, not the sharp silver of war. They landed gently at the edge of the field, no ramps, no troops. Just 3 figures stepping onto the soil of Terra Nova. For the first time, first came Elder Nara, her face lined with centuries, her eyes sharp but not unkind. She carried no weapon, only a staff of woven starlight. Next came Scholar Torin, young for an elf, his hands stained with ink, his gaze curious, not critical. Last came Envoy Rian, silent and watchful, his presence heavy with unspoken history. Lyra met them at the threshold, Kale beside her. Daniel, a step behind you came, she said. We had to, Elder Nara replied. The stories reached even the highest spires. They are not stories. Lyra said, they are choices. The envoys were led to the plaza, not as prisoners, not as guests, but as equals. Food was offered. Water drawn from the new wells, songs sung not in elven or human tongue but in a blend. Born that very week, through the day they watched, they listened. They asked few questions, but their eyes missed nothing. In the evening, Elder Nara approached Lyra as she sat by the edge of the field, watching Kale teach a group of children how to read the wind. You have done something dangerous, she said. What is that? You have made hope contagious. Lyra smiled faintly. Is that so bad? It is. If the rest of the galaxy is not ready, then we will wait until they are. Scholar Torin joined them, holding a small device that hummed softly. The core. It is not just power, is it? No, it is memory. It is connection. It is the echo of those who came before and believed we could be better. He looked at Daniel, who was helping an old woman carry firewood, and him. He is the reason it worked. Lyra said the elves tried to awaken the old ones through purity, the humans through force, but it took both to say yes together. Envoy Rian spoke. Then his voice rough like stone. The council will not accept this. Maybe not, but the people will, and people are louder than councils. That night the envoys did not return to their ships. They slept in the open plaza, wrapped in blankets woven by human hands, their dreams touched by the same light that had changed everyone else. On the fourth morning they prepared to leave. Elder Nara turned to Lyra one last time. You will be called before the High Court. No, you may be stripped of your title, your name, your life. I am already more than those things. The scholar bowed his head slightly. I will speak for you. And the envoy simply nodded. Before stepping aboard the ship, as the vessels rose into the sky, Kale let out a soft roar, not of challenge but of farewell. Daniel stood beside Lyra, his shoulder brushing hers. What now? Now we keep building, and if they come for you, then you stand with Mealway. Weeks turned to months, and the colony grew, not in size but in depth roots, spreading not just into soil but into each other. Stories were written not in data logs but in shared meals and lullabies sung in blended tongues, in the way a human child would rest her head on an elf's knee while, listening to tales of sky cities. Lyra never wore a crown again. But children brought her flowers woven into circlets, and she wore them without shame. Daniel never gave orders again. But people followed him because he listened first. Kale became legend, not for his fire but for his gentleness, often seen curled around the sick, or sleeping with his wings sheltering those caught in sudden storms. One evening as the twin moons rose, Lyra stood on the ridge where it all began. The wind cooled the stars. Bright Daniel joined her, his hand finding hers without a word. Do you ever miss the Sky Palace? Sometimes, she said, but not the silence. He smiled. Me neither. Below them the colony glowed soft and steady, not with the harsh light of reactors, but with the warm pulse of lanterns and lives intertwined. Her punishment had become her everything, not because she was forced to marry a human, but because she chose to see him not as lesser, but as equal. And in that choice, she found not just love, but a new kind of strength, one that did not conquer but connected. And as the old ones whispered through the stars once more, Lyra knew the real story was just beginning.